Here's the third portion of our class where we're going to spend some time focusing on how to companion someone in your own life who is grieving the loss of a loved one, not only during the holidays, but any time of year. How do I help that friend or family member or neighbor in a way that is most helpful and most beneficial to them? And I want to, again, talk about Dr. Alan Wolfelt, who has really pioneered this approach of companioning someone else who is in grief. And there's a few differences that can be helpful for us to point out between companioning and treating. For one thing, when let me back up just a second. Treating patients, we hear that phrase a lot. Doctors treat patients. Patient is what is a patient? Well, a patient is a passive, long-term sufferer. They are a patient. They have a malady that they are dealing with, and it's usually going to take a while, and they are sort of suffering through it. And to treat them is really comes from the Latin word which means to drag. And so treating patients, if we put a very literal definition, is dragging passive long-term sufferers along. Okay, that's a little exaggerated, but I don't think any of us want to drag along someone who is suffering through grief that we know. But instead, the word companion comes from Latin words which together mean messmate, or someone that you would want to share a meal with. That's really what companion means. Someone that you would share a meal with. This is what we want when we're grieving. We want someone to relate to us in that way. And it's what we need to be for someone who is grieving. And again, it follows our theme of being permission giving. About God being a God of permission in our grief. We want to companion people, and companioning someone in their grief is a way of giving them permission, not overriding them, not coming in and taking over their grief, but being with them and giving them permission to let their grief do what it needs to do, and you will simply be there with them. So a few comparisons. Companioning is not about teaching them, it is about curiosity. People who are grieving are usually not looking for answers, even when they ask a question. A grieving person who asks, "Why did God allow this?" As they're standing next to their husband's coffin, is usually not intended to bring about a theological discussion. That's not why they're asking that. Instead, as a companion, ask questions when appropriate to the person who is grieving. You might ask something like, "How are you doing today?" Add a time reference, not just "How are you doing," but "How are you doing today?" What is going well right now? Where or when are you finding your difficult moments? You are allowing them to tell you how they are feeling and giving them a frame of reference in which to do that. You are learning from them about their grief experience as opposed to telling them what to do or what they should be doing or what is happening to them. So instead of teaching, we want to be curious. We want to know how they're doing and let them tell us. Companioning is not about filling every painful moment with talk. It is about being still and discovering the gifts of sacred silence. And I love this image that illustrates this idea. Notice that while the owner of the dog is thinking about all these material things in his life, the dog is simply thinking about what he's doing right then, sitting with his owner. Talking is the go-to response for most of us in those awkward moments at a funeral, at a visitation, or even just in conversation with someone who is grieving. We want to fill that void with words. And yet remember, it was only when Job's friends spoke that they made things worse. Until then, they sat with him in silence, for they saw how great was his grief. They were present with him. Presence is a huge permission giver. Presence says, "I am here, and you do not need to change in my presence. I am simply here to try to help share that burden." And it's a huge comfort to them. When we have had church members with long illnesses, the ministry staff sometimes just makes a rotation of going and sitting with them in the waiting room and doing nothing more than just being there. And that says so much, usually better than you could ever say with words. Your silent, passive, but constant presence will be remembered. It'll be remembered. In the same way, companioning is not about trying to take away or relieve the person's pain. It's about being present to their pain. And this is a hard one. We want to try to fix the person that's grieving. We want to help them in a way that takes their pain away. I think that's especially hard for men. Men tend to be fixers. I want to fix the problems of those around me when they just want me to listen. When someone is in deep emotional turmoil, there is no amount of relief that any of us can provide. And to think that we can is a little bit arrogant. We are not going to be able to soothe the grief of the friend who has just lost their spouse or their child. What we can do, we can be there. We can be present. And it is enough. It is enough that I am here. And for them, it is enough that you are there. So being present to their pain. Also, companioning is not about imposing order and logic on the situation. It is about respecting disorder and confusion. Imagine going to someone's house and not just cleaning up their mess, but reorganizing it. This would really go better here. You're not trying to hurt, you're trying to help them, but what you're doing is, to them as the homeowner, they are not appreciative of that. You would be offended that this person is coming in and rearranging things to be better, to do so in a better way. That's really what we're doing when we try to impose some sense of logic and order on someone else's grief. When we give them those kind of religious cliches, or we try to explain how this was God's plan when they haven't asked us to, or try to tell them how they should feel, or most harmful, why what they're feeling is not good, why it's not rational. But companioning says, I'm not here to clean your mess. I'm here to sit with you in your mess. I'm here to just be present. I'm not here to clean it up. And notice how all of those things that we've just talked about, notice how they are all counterintuitive. They are the opposite, usually, of what we feel like we ought to do. And it's certainly the opposite of what culture says we ought to do. And these aspects of companioning are very much permission giving. They are following the Columbo approach, and they are letting the grieving person be their own expert to their grief. Again, whatever a grieving person is doing, it is usually the best thing they can think of at the time to deal with the situation. And so let's bring to them not necessarily what we think they need, but let's bring them what they deserve. Let's bring them what they have earned as someone who is grieving. They deserve warmth and acceptance. They deserve listening. They deserve minimal response from us, especially unprovoked. And they deserve genuine honesty. Don't treat them like a Fabergé egg. Don't whisper about them to someone else within earshot. Don't act like they are some fragile vessel that can break if I'm not careful. Be yourself around them. Realize their own strength as a fellow human being to whom God has given the ability to grieve as a way to cope. So, some final practical thoughts on companioning and how to help people. What are some things I can do or not do to help the person around me who is grieving? Number one, take some kind of action. Call, send a card, give a hug when you see them, attend the funeral. This is a big one. If you are at all able, attend the funeral. They may not remember you physically or visually, but they will see your name in that book, and they will see your name along with all these other names of people who came to support them and to remember the life of the person that has died. And these sound like little things, but it's the little things that don't mean much, which really end up meaning the most. So do something, even if it's small and even if it's one time, do it. Because when those things happen in abundance, it means a lot. Number two, be available. Especially in our culture today, we're always go, go, go. We're going from one thing to the next. We fill our schedules and our planners. Try not to convey urgency on your part when you are talking to the grieving person. A grieving person has usually built up a lot of courage if they do eventually call you or ask if they can talk with you. That takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of strength, it takes a lot of courage. Do what you can, even if it means putting them off for the moment in order for you to meet with them at a time that is better for you to give them more of your attention. Make time for them. Realize that they may need a while to talk with you, and if at all possible, be as present and be as patient as you can during that time. It will do so much for them. Be a good listener. Don't judge, don't condemn, don't instruct. Listen. And again, that can be hard. As they're talking, you might be thinking of what your response ought to be. Well, here's what you ought to do. Well, here's why that's really not a good idea. Um, Avoid that. Simply listen and say things like, that sounds really hard. That sounds really hard what you're going through. I can imagine that that's very difficult. Empathize, validate, affirm, be a good listener. Don't avoid talking about the person who died. We talked about this already. The grieving person wants to talk about the person that has died. They want to hear others talk about them too. But it seems like that's not what we want to do because we don't want them to feel uncomfortable. The unhelpful ways that we behave around a grieving person are usually subconsciously about helping ourselves feel less awkward or uncomfortable about the death. The sooner the grieving person starts acting normal again, the more comfortable we will feel around them. And so we inadvertently push them toward closure and moving on. Isn't it amazing how, even in our desire to help someone else, what we might be doing without realizing it is really trying to help ourselves at their expense, at the expense of their grief. So again, I think of Doug Manning's advice where he says, hug, hush, hang around. Those are some good things that you can do to help someone. And then I want to close our class finally with a longer quote from Doug from The Gift of Significance. I think it sums up our discussion well today. Doug writes, and he says, we are doing well with our grief when we are grieving. Somehow we have it backwards. We think that people are doing well when they aren't crying. But grief is a process of walking through some painful periods toward learning to cope again. We do not walk this path without some pain and tears. When we are in the most pain, we are making the most progress. When the pain is less, we are coasting and resting up for the next steps. People need to grieve, and grief is not an enemy to be avoided. It is a healing path to be walked. I hope very much that this class has been helpful to you today, not only as you deal with whatever grief you might have in your own life, or helping someone else with the grief that they are going through, but that it's helped you with this upcoming holiday season and all year long. I want to remind you that the Waterview Church of Christ is here to minister to those in grief. We have a lot of different resources available, including our own grief support group and our partnership with GriefWorks in Dallas. And if our church can ever be of help to you or to someone you know, we would love to take advantage of that and look at ways that we can minister to them. And you can visit us at waterview.org to learn more about any of those ways. Thanks for watching.